I'm Michael Hitchborn, and this is the American Life League Report. The federal government already funnels hundreds of millions of dollars to Planned Parenthood every year, so it should come as no surprise when it funnels your money to celebrate its founder. The Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery recently opened a new, federally funded exhibit that, according to the museum's curator, celebrates women who have challenged and changed America over the past century. Included in the list is notorious liberal feminist Margaret Sanger. The National Portrait Gallery website provides a brief description of Sanger, describing a concerned crusader who fought with the courage of a wounded tiger for the promotion of birth control. What the Smithsonian exhibit fails to mention, however, is that Margaret Sanger founded the largest abortion chain in the country, now known as Planned Parenthood. But the exhibit also fails to explain the racist ideology behind Sanger's promotion of birth control. Many people don't really know what eugenics is. Eugenics is defined as belief in the possibility of improving the qualities of the human species by discouraging reproduction by persons having genetic defects or presumed to have inheritable, undesirable traits. Essentially, eugenics is the creation of a master race by controlling who has children and who doesn't. An article appearing in the January 31st, 1922 edition of the New York Times bore the headline, "Mrs. Sanger says Superman is the aim of birth control." If creating a race of supermen is the goal, who did Sanger believe had genetic defects or undesirable traits that stood in the way? In his book, Birth Control, Facts and Responsibilities, Adolf Meyer quoted an essay Sanger wrote in 1925, entitled, "The Need of Birth Control in America."
The dark origins of Planned Parenthood, from eugenics to birth control. Planned Parenthood is one of the most recognizable nonprofit organizations in the world. To its supporters, it represents women's health care, reproductive freedom, and access to contraception. Millions of women have relied on its services, and today, the organization presents itself as a champion of reproductive rights. But behind this modern image lies a complicated history, one that intersects with one of the darkest social movements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. To understand that history, we have to go back long before Planned Parenthood existed, into the late 19th century, the British Empire. Pax Britannica. By the beginning of the 19th century, Britain had emerged as the world's unrivaled superpower. Its victory over Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815 marked the end of more than 2 decades of European conflict and ushered in a century of relative global stability known as Pax Britannica, the British peace. Protected by the world's most powerful navy and fueled by the Industrial Revolution, Britain became the central force in international trade, finance, and diplomacy. Between 1815 and the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, the British Empire expanded to encompass nearly 10 million square miles of territory and governed approximately 400 million people, nearly 1/4 of the world's population. In modern terms, roughly the area of the United States of America. This unprecedented reach gave Britain enormous influence over the global economy. British banks financed governments and industries across the world, while British merchants dominated international shipping routes through a combination of military power, economic leverage, and diplomacy. Britain exerted significant influence over the economies of nations as diverse as China, Argentina, Siam, and most importantly, India. Steamships dramatically reduced travel times across the oceans, while the invention of the electric telegraph allowed London to communicate with distant colonies in a matter of hours rather than months. For the first time in history, a government could effectively administer an empire that spanned every inhabited continent. No colony proved more valuable than India. Originally governed by the East India Company, a private corporation granted extraordinary powers by the British Crown, India gradually came under direct imperial rule following the Indian Rebellion of 1857. In 1858, the British government established the British Raj, transforming India into the crown jewel of the empire. Its vast population, natural resources, and strategic location made it indispensable to Britain's economic and global dominance. Yet Britain's supremacy was constantly challenged. Throughout the 19th century, the empire engaged in a prolonged geopolitical rivalry with the expanding Russian Empire in Central Asia, a contest later known as the Great Game. Both powers sought influence over Afghanistan, Persia, and their approaches to India, fearing that control of these regions would determine the balance of power in Asia. While Britain generally avoided major wars in Europe after Napoleon's defeat, it fought dozens of military campaigns across its empire to suppress rebellions, expand colonial holdings, and protect its commercial interest. Historians estimate that during the era of Pax Britannica, Britain participated in well over 100 military conflicts, ranging from colonial expeditions to major wars such as the Crimean War and the Boer War. By the late 19th century, the British Empire had become more than a collection of colonies. It had become the infrastructure of globalization itself. Goods, capital, information, and people flowed through networks controlled by Britain, connecting continents in ways never before imagined. It was within this world empire that prized science, administration, and social engineering, that movements like eugenics found fertile ground among many members of Britain's political and intellectual elite. In 1883, British scientist Sir Francis Galton coined the term eugenics, or race improvement. I have no patience with a hypothesis occasionally expressed and often implied, especially in tales written to teach children to be good, that babies are born pretty much alike, and that the sole agencies in creating differences between boy and man, are steady application and moral effort. It is in the most unqualified manner that I object to pretensions of natural equality. The experiences of the nursery, the school, the university, and the professional careers are a chain of proofs to the contrary. Galton was no ordinary academic. He was an accomplished statistician, inventor of the first modern weather map, a pioneer in behavioral genetics, and perhaps most importantly, the cousin of Charles Darwin. Inspired by Darwin's theory of natural selection, Galton wondered whether humanity itself could be improved through selective breeding. If desirable traits could be inherited, he reasoned, then society should encourage reproduction among the fit while discouraging among the unfit. The fit class of society is supposed to be the peoples most worthy of bearing children, which would have been made up of middle, upper, and noble classes of Nordic Teutonic Europeans. He called this idea well-born. This encompasses mainly the Germanic, Nordic, and Anglo-Saxon races, while practically everybody else was considered unfit, even if you were perfectly healthy and possibly even had some desirable traits like being tall. For your worth in society was based solely on the class you were born in or the direct economic or martial benefit one bestowed into their society. People with real physical and mental handicaps would hypothetically be classified together with racial minorities and ethnic immigrants. Galton and other eugenicists of the time wanted the fit classes to have as large of families as possible, for if they did not, they are selfishly not committing their duty to their race and committing racial suicide. Birth control and other forms of contraceptives were not heavily marketed, for they had little faith that the unfits would actually use the methods. So, they promoted sterilization as a better option. Galton believed intelligence, morality, criminality, and even poverty were largely inherited. If governments could influence who reproduced, he believed the overall quality of humanity would improve. A democracy cannot endure unless it be composed of able citizens. Therefore, it must, in self-defense, withstand the free introduction of degenerate stock. These ideas quickly spread throughout Europe and the United States. By the early 20th century, eugenics had become a respected academic discipline, taught at universities and promoted by scientists, physicians, politicians, and social reformers. The movement classified entire populations according to perceived biological worth, particularly those described as Nordic, Anglo-Saxon, and Germanic, were often portrayed as genetically superior, while immigrants, the poor, people with disabilities, the mentally ill, and those considered immoral were increasingly viewed as burdens on society. These beliefs soon moved beyond theory. Across the United States and Europe, governments enacted compulsory sterilization laws targeting those deemed unfit. Tens of thousands of people were sterilized without meaningful consent. What begun as an academic theory involved a public policy. I think that stern compulsion ought to be exerted to prevent the free propagation of the stock of those who are seriously afflicted by lunacy, feeble-mindedness, habitual criminality, pauperism, but that is quite different. Compulsory marriage. Eugenics Education Society. As supporters for eugenics continued to grow, its advocates sought to transform the movement from an academic theory into public policy. In 1907, reformer Sybil Neville Rolfe with the support of Sir Francis Galton, helped establish the Eugenics Education Society in Britain. The organization was founded on the belief that social problems such as poverty, crime, and dependence on public assistance were not merely economical or environmental issues, but were largely rooted in heredity. If society could influence who reproduced, its members believed they could improve the nation's genetic stock and reduce social decline. To achieve these goals, the society promoted a wide range of social and political reforms. It advocated the following: discouraging people living in workhouses from having children, limiting reproduction among those considered to have low intelligence, encouraging young adults to become financially independent and marry early, making divorce more accessible to correct what they viewed as poor marital matches, and holding fathers legally responsible for children born outside of marriage. Members also proposed creating a government Ministry of Health with a dedicated department focused on eugenics to collect hereditary data and develop national population policies, while encouraging eugenicists themselves to take positions within government to help shape legislation. Although these proposals varied in their likelihood of implementation, they revealed how far-reaching the ambitions of the movement had become. Eugenics was no longer simply a scientific theory discussed in academic circles. It had become a political project aimed at reshaping society itself. In the 1980s, the Eugenics Education Society changed its name to the Galton Institute, distinguishing itself from the increasingly discredited term eugenics. Today, the organization operates as the Adelphi Genetics Forum, reflecting yet another rebranding as public attitudes toward eugenics fundamentally shifted in the aftermath of the Second World War. Margaret Sanger. Into this world of scientific optimism, imperial confidence, and growing concern over population came one of the most influential and uncontroversial figures in the history of reproductive rights, Margaret Sanger. Born in 1879 in Corning, New York, Sanger was the sixth of 11 surviving children in a working-class Irish-American family. She often pointed to her mother's repeated pregnancies and declining health as defining influence on her views about contraceptions, believing that women should not be forced into endless cycles of childbirth. After training as a nurse, Sanger worked in some of New York City's poorest immigrant neighborhoods, where she witnessed firsthand the consequences of poverty, dangerous self-induced abortions, and women who lacked access to reliable birth control. These experiences convinced her that giving women control over reproduction was essential to improving both individual lives and public health. At the time, however, even discussing contraception was considered a criminal offense under the Federal Comstock Act of 1873, which classified contraceptive information and devices as obscene materials and prohibited their distribution through the mail. Determined to challenge these restrictions, Sanger began publishing articles advocating for birth control and educating women about contraception despite the legal risk. In 1916, Sanger opened America's first birth control clinic in Brooklyn alongside her sister, Ethel Byrne, and activist Fania Mendel. The clinic remained open for 10 days before police raided the facility. Sanger, Byrne, and Mendel were arrested for violating New York's obscenity laws, and the trial that followed brought national attention to the birth control movement. Rather than ending her campaign, the arrest transformed Sanger into the public face of a growing movement that challenged both legal restrictions and long-standing cultural taboos surrounding contraception. Over the following decades, Sanger founded the American Birth Control League, the organization that would eventually become Planned Parenthood Federation of America, in 1942. She also played an instrumental role in promoting research that ultimately contributed to the development of the first oral contraceptive pill in the 1950s. Although the pill itself was developed years after her most active period of leadership. To many supporters, Margaret Sanger was a pioneer who fought for women's bodily autonomy at a time when discussing birth control could lead to arrest. To her critics, however, another side of her legacy cannot be ignored. Sanger's campaign for birth control emerged during the height of the eugenics movement, and she frequently collaborated with leading eugenicists of her day. She spoke before eugenics organizations, published articles by prominent eugenic thinkers in her journal, Birth Control Review, and at times argued that birth control could reduce the reproduction of those considered unfit. While historians continue to debate the extent to which these views reflected strategic alliances versus deeply held convictions, there is little dispute that Sanger willingly engaged with the eugenics movement and adopted some of its language to advance the cause of birth control. Understanding her legacy requires acknowledging both dimensions: a pioneering advocate for reproductive freedom and a reformer whose work intersected with one of the most controversial scientific movements of the 20th century. Birth Control League to Planned Parenthood. Sanger founded the American Birth Control League in 1921. Over time, the public attitudes toward contraception began to change. In 1942, the organization adopted a new name, Planned Parenthood. The rebranding emphasized family planning and maternal health rather than birth limitation alone. The movement continued to gain legitimacy throughout the following decades. A major turning point came in 1965 when the Supreme Court's decision in Griswold v. Connecticut recognized a constitutional right for married couples to obtain contraception. Legal barriers continued to fall. Under President Richard Nixon, the federal government dramatically expanded funding for family planning programs through Title X in 1970. Birth control had become part of mainstream American healthcare. The international connection. The story did not stop in the United States. In Britain, the Eugenics Society gradually shifted its public messaging after the atrocities of Nazi Germany made explicit eugenics politically toxic. Rather than abandoning its objective entirely, some members argued that similar goals could be pursued through population planning and voluntary family limitation. One of the society's most influential figures was Carlos Patton Blacker. A decorated veteran of the First World War, Blacker believed war disproportionately killed healthy young men while allowing those he considered genetically inferior to reproduce. He served as secretary of the Eugenics Society from 1931 to 1952. Following World War II, Blacker advocated pursuing what he described as crypto-eugenics, advancing eugenic objectives through less overt policies centered on family planning and birth control. In 1952, he became the first president of the newly established International Planned Parenthood Federation. His appointment illustrates how some influential figures who had previously promoted eugenics later assumed leadership roles within the international family planning movement. Whether this represented a continuity of ideology or simply an evolution in public health policy remains heavily debated by historians. A complicated legacy. Today, Planned Parenthood rejects eugenics and publicly acknowledges that Margaret Sanger's association with the movement are deeply troubling. In recent years, the organization has distanced itself from parts of Sanger's legacy, including removing her name from some facilities and recognizing the harm caused by racist and eugenic ideas. Yet the historical records remain. The birth control movement did not develop in isolation. It emerged during an era when eugenics was embraced by many intellectuals, physicians, politicians, and reformers. Some advocates saw contraception primarily as a means of empowering women. Others viewed it as a tool for managing population they considered undesirable. In many cases, those motivations overlap. Understanding this history does not require ignoring Planned Parenthood's modern role, nor does it require excusing the beliefs of its early supporters. Instead, it requires confronting a more uncomfortable truth. Movements that later become symbols of progress can still carry the assumptions, prejudices, and ambitions of the age in which they were born. The origins of Planned Parenthood are not simply a story about reproductive rights. They are also part of the larger history of eugenics, scientific optimism, population control, and the enduring question of who gets to decide which lives are worth bringing into the world.